we are going to start. We've got a few extra minutes, so why not just take advantage of them? We get 2.5 extra minutes. So I think this is an incredibly important topic. I'm very excited that we're discussing it with three people who actually know what they're talking about. I don't think I have to introduce, well, perhaps I should introduce the participants. I'm just going to try and get the correct titles, which I haven't sorted out as well as I should have done, for which I apologize. Okay, Adam Tooze on my far left is the Shelby Cullom Davis Chair of History at Columbia University. To his right is Fang Xinghai, who's Vice Chairman of the China Securities Regulatory Commission, and as I've discovered, in fact, covers basically everything. And to his right is Minouche Shafik, who is currently Director of the LSE. Before that was Deputy Governor of the Bank of England, and before that was something incredibly important at the IMF, but I can't remember. Europe Department? Deputy Managing Director. So I knew it was incredibly important. So a CV like yours is too complicated to keep up with. So we're going to talk about when global orders fail. I suppose the question people like us tend, or at least I have to have, is this 1900 or 1930? Or something quite different. But obviously, the thing we are going to focus on, or the things we might be thinking about, are two interrelated phenomena. The first, pretty obviously, is the changing balance of global power and global power relations in all dimensions. And in that respect, it rhymes. I used that famous apocryphal remark of Mark Twain in a recent piece with 1900. And the other, of course, is the pressure on the tension in what we used to call the liberal international order, which we associated with American power and American purpose in the post-Second World War world, and which many of us thought, fools that we were, had sort of triumphed by the early 1990s and had become the paradigm for everybody, including the rising power of China. And that now looks very different for many, many, many reasons, not least that the Americans, God bless them, have invented a president who thinks that all was a crooked fraud on the American people. And that clearly changes the world in a very remarkable way. Obviously, the most recent developments, and this is my very last introductory comment, are those that have occurred in the last year, during which the trade war, whatever you call it, that people had been expecting has been launched and is, of course, ongoing, as you will read in your newspaper, and in which I think even more significantly, important parts of the American establishment have decided, very important parts of the American establishment, that China should be regarded as a strategic rival across the board. So is it 1900 or 1930 or perhaps 1910 and 1935? So that's the introduction that I would make. Now, to set the scene for our understanding and discussion of this incredibly important topic, the whole shape of the world in which we and our children and grandchildren will live, I think, Adam Tooze will lay out what history has to tell us.
Thank you, Martin. I have a very immodest job on my hands, as Martin has suggested, trying to present to you what history has to tell us about our current situation in a slightly long 10 minutes, with my eye on the precision Swiss chronometer behind you. I thought what I would try and do is actually make three remarks fundamentally about pitfalls in thinking historically about our current situation. Because when global orders fail or look as though they are failing, as I think our current moment suggests they might be, or it might be, it induces a sort of nostalgia in us. We go looking for a better past. We go looking for better places when things were different, because this sense of decline or crisis is framed against some alternative backdrop. In the program of this year's Davos meeting, the reference is to a post-war order. And I think what is conjured up by this is some moment like 1945. We speak about that American hotel complex, Bretton Woods, where the order that was apparently prevailed after World War II was shaped. What I want to start by doing is really putting that story on the skids. I think it's a profoundly unhelpful way of thinking about our current situation. If you projected yourself back to the aftermath of World War II, it didn't look like the achievement of a stable, liberal, democratic order. It was an age of penury. Millions of Europeans were starving, and that's not to mention the chaos in the post-colonial world of the period, or the division of the world that would ensue with the Cold War. If you think about the Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank, the IMF, though they were indeed in blueprint designed in 1944, the first effort to actually implement what we think of as the Bretton Woods order, which would be capital mobility with fixed exchange rates, failed immediately in 1947 when the richest European country attempted to implement it. Instead of actually starting in 1945, the liberal international order that we associate with the name Bretton Woods really came into existence incrementally, anxiously driven as much by crisis as anything else. The grand design for trade never really got off the ground at all. We ended up not with the ITO, but with GATT. It wasn't until 1958 that something resembling the initial design was actually put in place. And in the sense that we achieved fixed exchange rates between the major economies of the world with extensive capital mobility. And almost within 5 to 10 years, massive tensions began to build up with that system, which made its demise predictable. What I'm trying to put across is the idea that this idea of international ordering, we need to take it with a pinch of salt. It's actually a rather fragmentary, eclectic exercise with short time spans. By the late 1960s, the fiscal and monetary pressures on the United States were such that it was evident that Bretton Woods' lifespan was going to be short. Between 1971 and 1973, it was taken apart under the impact of massive trade imbalances, US and UK deficits, Japanese and German surpluses, a very familiar picture which resulted in, essentially, the first iteration, you might think, of a cynical populist Republican politics with a nationalist tinge, and the disreputable domestic politics which would be Richard Nixon, disassembling Bretton Woods between 1971 and 73, and really Trump has nothing on him in terms of his insouciance about the international order when it was pointed out to President Nixon that the Italians might suffer collateral damage from his policy. The Watergate tapes pick up the immortal comment, "I don't give a bleep about the lira." This was a president acting in America's interest. This is not a new phenomenon. And think about the 1970s that followed. We talk today about the crisis of populism and the protests of the Gilets jaunes. Remember Italy, remember France, remember Britain in the 1970s, the movement of organized communist and socialist workers occupying factories. We talk today about rising tensions between China and the United States. Remember the Cold War in the 1970s, when this was a real strategic nuclear standoff, and the Soviet Union launched its last major offensive in Afghanistan at the end of the 70s. We talk today about the crisis of liberal order and the dismissal of human values around the world. Think of Asia in the 1970s. Think of the violence in Bangladesh. Think of the appalling suffering in Cambodia. Think of the turmoil in China in that period. It takes a particularly Eurocentric view to look at our current moment and diagnose it as one as chaos and disorder. If you take the perspective of the vast majority of the world, this is a really strange chronology to be applying. Let's go back to the calm of macroeconomics. Here's a mapping of the number of countries experiencing high, moderate, and low inflation. And again, you can see how this story of a post-war order just falls apart. This is the kind of tease amazing work that historians like to do. It's a sort of deconstruction. You can see why Bretton Woods wouldn't work in the early phase, because there was just too much inflation around the world economy. You can see how it then was stabilized, but then, of course, we can see the surge into high inflation zones in the 1970s and 1980s. So the first point that I want to make to you is that when we talk about post-war orders as the backdrop to our current discontent, I think we need to be clear about which war it is, the post of which we're talking about. It isn't World War II. It's not 1945. It's the Cold War. As Martin alluded to. The immediate backdrop to our current anxiety is much more recent than we like to imagine, and we shouldn't confer on it the kind of dignity of an ancient lineage that goes back to the great heroic moment of World War II and the Greatest Generation and that early moment of globalism. It was made, frankly, by people in this room from the 1990s onwards in places like this, in institutions like the IMF, reconceived in the 1990s as an agency with much broader reach than it ever had in the days of John Maynard Keynes. So this is really the backdrop. It's the winning of the Cold War. Now, from this, however, I want to follow on to two further points, which point, I think, to the ambiguity of this narrative about the West's victory in the Cold War and its benefits. Because it is undoubtedly out of that moment that emerges the complacency, but also the creative work of the 1990s and the 2000s. If you look at a map of the number of trade agreements, multilateral agreements that have been struck in the world, it flatlines in the 50s, 60s, and 70s as GATT moves slowly through its paces, and then surges from the 1990s onwards as all around the world states try to bind themselves together in bilateral, multilateral, regional agreements. It's not by coincidence that the WTO projected in 44 actually comes into existence in 1995. There had been, of course, progressive globalization before that, but it's really in the 1990s that it acquires what Hegel would call self-consciousness. It's not just globalization in itself, it's globalization for itself, a project that understands itself in those terms. It coincides, of course, also with what Ben Bernanke dubs the Great Moderation, that sense that all of the major tensions in the world economy, this is the Economist version of the end of history story, we've learned how to do macroeconomic governance. We aren't going to experience profound crises anymore. What I would want to point to today is, in my second point, is a deep ambiguity that lies behind this. Because a precondition for that victory was a major shift in the balance of power between capital and labor, as profound a shift as we have ever seen in history. It is a period of rising inequality. Really, the 70s and 80s and 90s is where the damage is done in the United States and the United Kingdom. It is a period of rising inequality, but it is a period of massive labor quiescence. What is missing in between is the organized labor movement and social democracy. We should be clear about what was lost at that moment as well as what was gained. If political stability, macroeconomic stability, if economic governance became unimaginably easier than it was in the 1970s, it was in large part because the Western European and American labor movements were gutted. And at the time, that seemed like a step towards rationalism and reason in economic governance. But I would like to submit to you the contention that in so doing, what we also did, and it was really a process of action, it wasn't just simply a matter of neglect. Here is the number of strikes in the United States. It was the result of a concerted rollback of the capacity of trade unions to organize collectively. The effect of this was to destabilize and undercut the fabric of European and American society on which our modern democracies were based. What this did was to remove the stuffing of civil society around which political democracy was organized. If there was anyone who believed that focus group democracy, the curse of the present, was not enough, that leaders should do more than simply reflect the preferences of their individual voters, it was social democratic politicians who always believed in the educative function of democracy. Because you couldn't take what ordinary people thought at face value because it was full of nonsense, which they acquired through the capitalist media, which were the first bastion of defense of the system. If there was anyone who opposed fake news and that insisted on fact-based argument, it was the left historically that did that. And if we want to understand this frankly superstitious irrational politics which has flooded into the space of democracy in the last decade or so, we need to reckon with the effect of that process through which the guts of democracy were torn out. It's a bit like secularization. The decline of religion does not give way, as many of us liberals would imagine, to the sweet reason of enlightenment. More often than not, it opens up the space for superstition. Horoscopes come in the place of secularization. Horoscopes, not rational science on the whole. Moving very briefly now to the big picture dimension that Martin outlined, the sense of the wider world. The second great shock of our current moment is obviously the global power shift that he alluded to. And one way in which that manifested itself was precisely as with regard to the Labour story, in the success of international trade. If China is shifting the balance, clearly we need to take credit for it in the West, in a sense, as the achievement of actual convergence. The tragedy of economic growth up to the 1990s was precisely how few countries benefited from it. The remarkable feature of economic growth since the 1990s is it actually exhibits convergence. Poorer countries grow faster than richer countries. Where labor is cheaper, you experience more rapid growth. That's a novel feature of the world economy. And you can see the shocks that this exercised on the American economy here, first the Japan shock, then the Mexican shock, then the Chinese shock, is an impact. But it points, I think, to two far more unsettling dimensions of history that I want to conclude by highlighting for you. In the same way as the triumph over Labour and the rolling back of organised Labour's grip on European politics had ambiguous effects, we're discovering, of course, that this does too. And one of the effects that it does is to dramatically shift the balance of power towards Asia. And what the West is shockingly waking up to is that it's not, in fact, altogether clear that we did win the Cold War where it mattered most. We won it in Europe, evidently. The collapse of the Soviet Union is one of the most dramatic collapses ever seen. But think about the military history. We didn't win in Korea, we didn't win in Vietnam, we never won in China, on the contrary. Now, of course, the Chinese, the Vietnamese, and the North Korean regime are reacting to the world and reacting in ways which have integrated them. This process is, of course, as much driven by the Beijing side as it is by the West. But the globalization that we experience has been co-constructed by a state which remains under the control, as we know, of an authoritarian regime with communist DNA. When Chinese speak at fora like this, as I witnessed on a panel yesterday, however, they don't speak in the terms necessarily of the communist revolution and the revolutionary rhetoric. What they invoke is, in fact, an even deeper and even more unsettling history. And this is the final point that I really want to leave you with. And it's a response to Martin's question, are we seeing 1910, 1930, or something different? And my argument will be it's something quite different because of the dimensions we're talking about. When you hear Chinese colleagues talk about the current situation, as we did yesterday, they will very rapidly take you back to what seems to us in the West to be ancient history. They will take you back to the Opium Wars. And it's very easy to dismiss that as a sort of reflex of nationalist propaganda, as serious and grievous a crime as they were. But this kind of graph, produced by the colleagues at The Economist, shows you the macroeconomic reason behind that. Through to the early 19th century, through to the moment just before the Opium Wars, China was, in fact, an absolutely dominant part of the world economy to the extent which exceeded even its present moment. So the historic dimension, which I think we need to judge our current moment in, is this layering of the triumph since the 1990s, the residual effects of the Cold War which remain present in the political DNA of much of the East Asian nation states. But we also have to reckon with the fact that the historic shift is one that is measured not just in years or in decades, but in centuries, and indeed in the mind of Chinese politics in millennia. This is what the harping on the ancientness of their civilization means. And the upshot of that is that the question of political order and international order needs to be posed in dimensions which we just simply are radically unfamiliar with. The problem is not going back to 1945, which is irrelevant, as I've argued. The problem is there is no moment in the history of Western ordering of the world which is relevant to this experience. While we were doing the Congress of Vienna after 1815, we were humiliating China in the Opium Wars. There is no historic model for the challenge that we currently face. And we're facing it in conjunction with a power which is overlaid with the history of the 20th century. But if you fold my two arguments together, there is also a very surprising denouement in this. What makes China attractive to us as an international partner and builds the bridge to Davos is is the fact that China's regime, as authoritarian as it is a fully paid up member of the modernization club. And that, too, is part of the communist DNA of the Chinese regime in the present day. Their belief in science, their commitment to technology, their commitment to large-scale technocratic solutions makes us in the West increasingly look like the inhabitants of a backward period. And that itself is an ironic legacy of this overlaying, I think, of histories that we have to contend with. Thank you very much for your patience.
That was a wonderful and fascinating introduction with quite fair chunks of which I disagree. So it would have been a fun discussion to have had. But just one small point, because I feel that France, Germany, and even Italy and Britain were not very relevant political concepts in the year one. So the relevant one is the Roman Empire. The work of Ian Morris suggests it was much the same size as the Han Empire. But never mind. That is actually itself a very interesting point, which you might think about. The West's subsequent history was one of division.
Fragmentation. Yeah.
And that's crucial, I think. It's not an irrelevant point, because we lost the great empire and ended up with the nation states, and China didn't. However, that's a small point, but a relevant one, I think. So I would like to start with you, Fang, Xinghai, on what you don't need to go over all this, but casting it forward, and that's the question, and now and the future. What do you think China's view is, the view of your leaders, your people, of global order and the place of China in it in this century?
Well,
a nice simple topic.
First of all, I am a government official, but today I only speak for myself. I don't represent the government. So
of course.
I make this disclaimer. How China views the current world? Well, we think the world is undergoing something what we call once in a 100-year time transition. So it's a huge change. And then how does China view itself in this change, in this transition? What is the new order we are advocating or we would like to see? I think there's no better description of what China wants than what President Xi has said repeatedly, and that is, we want to see a world, what we call a community with shared interest, right? So it's a new order in which every country can prosper. And now you may say, how do you do that, right? Yes, we are still at the beginning of this vision. China is trying to build this vision. And there are a lot of mechanics that have to be thought through and to be established, as Professor Tooze described over history. Any new order needs the mechanism, right? And then you have to find out how the major powers work together. So it leads to the question that you want to ask.
So let's follow that up briefly as a framework. The once in 100-year, or as Adam is suggesting, perhaps once in a half a millennium transition. I mean, that's the implication.
Absolutely.
The reversal of the age of growing European dominance. Obviously is centered on China itself. As Adam has also pointed out, China undoubtedly prospered enormously and spectacularly in the last 4 decades, just staggering, within whatever we call this order, the post-Second World War, the post-Cold War order. How content do you feel with the way, we'll now get to what the US role is, how you see the US role, with the way that order worked, the institutions. President Xi came here to talk about globalization, so the WTO, all that. Is your basic, would it be a reasonable thing just to conclude that the Chinese feel, actually, It's a pretty good order. Did great for us.
Yes.
And you are the conservative power. And you'd like to keep the order we thought we created. Would that be reasonable conclusion, or would that completely wrong?
Martin, I agree with you. China is a huge beneficiary of this order. And you mentioned, the change that we are seeing is a result of mainly of China's rise, right?
Of course.
Certainly, China's rise is part of the contributing factors for this change, but it's not the entire factor. I'm not sure that even is the most important factor. I think the most important factor is that, in the Western countries, you're experiencing tremendous domestic difficulties. And democracy, as you have described, is not working very well. And you have to realize that. And you need political reforms in your countries. I mean, I say that, with all sincerity.
No, you're absolutely right.
Yes, and you cannot, just turn your attention to other countries and try to paper over, all the difficulties that you're experiencing. And I think that is even a bigger factor, contributing factor, for this once in a 100-year change that we are describing.
I agree with that, and we'll come to that in a second, for sure.
But of course, the order.
But the question let's assume that we buy the proposition that, very, very large part of the blame for the mess we seem to be in, I think we sort of agree we're in a mess, even if we don't, is because of screw-ups we made. But the question I had is, do you see China actually in the rather anomalous position of saying, well, not anomalous, surprising position, actually, so far as the way world trade works, particularly investment, things like that, we'd like it all to go on the way it was over the last 40 years, and we don't really want to change it. We would like to preserve that, and the reason we can't preserve it is because you guys don't understand how to run it, and you've got to shape up.
I see. Okay. Well, I think for this sort of community of shared interests or shared progress, that new community will certainly preserve a lot of the features of this liberal order that you just described, because it is a good order. I mean, and the reason that this order doesn't seem to be kind of working anymore is not just because of China's rise. It's because of a lot of domestic issues in these Western countries. And you need to modify this order, just we have to modify the WTO. And China is very much part of this process. We want to actively participate in this modification so that we can preserve most of the good features of this current order. But in this new order, it has to be slightly different, right? Because, as you said, China is a much bigger player. And then Russia, India will become a big player as well. And you need to accommodate these new players. But I do think this, what you call liberal order with free flow of capital, goods, services, is something that's good. And we should not discard that.
Okay, so there we have the defender of the liberal international order. You can come back to that.
The features, yeah.
Minouche, how do you see this, and how far you recognize, I think, the shared view of these distinguished speakers that we comprehensively screwed up and destroyed the basis of legitimacy of our societies, and we should all go back to 1980 and reverse everything that's happened since then? I'm being a bit provocative, but it is my job.
I mean, I spent 25 years of my career in the international system, making this order work at the IMF, at the World Bank, at the Department for International Development in the international aid system. So I kind of, I guess I certainly believe that that order delivered huge gains in prosperity for humanity and the biggest reduction in poverty humanity has ever seen. So I think the order did work relatively well. And the problem we see in terms of what's happened with global income distribution and the hollowing out of the middle class and the advanced economies was primarily the fault of national policy. Yeah. And the failure of national policies in the advanced economies to share the benefits of globalization. So I agree with that. But I also think that a variety of forces are changing the nature of globalization such that going back to the old way is not going to work. And I think we need to think about it differently. And those forces are the following. I mean, first, technology and automation will mean the rapid growth in trade that we saw over the last 20 years is declining. Yeah. And we see it. We've all been scratching our heads and saying, why is the growth in trade slowing? I think it's because a lot of localization is happening as automation is enabling manufacturing to occur in higher wage economies. And I think a lot of it also has to do with China shifting from an export-oriented strategy to a consumption-based one. I think the other thing that changed was after the financial crisis, global bank flows collapsed. And part of that was because of regulation and because central banks and regulators said, you need to put order into your balance sheets and reduce the risks you're running. And so we've already seen a decline in global banking flows. And I think that's probably a good thing. And current financial flows are dominated by foreign direct investment. And I think that's probably a good thing. You know, there's not a lot of good that comes out of, frankly, short-term portfolio flows. And there are not a lot of economic benefits. And I'm not particularly sad to see those fall. So I think trade flows will change and decline in terms of the rate of growth. I think financial flows are changing and probably moving to a more stable place. I think the new frontier for globalization is going to be around people. And we see the tensions around people. And you know, demography is destiny, and you see where the growth in demography is going to be, and it's going to be in Africa, and to a lesser extent in Asia, and that's going to create huge challenges for the world. And the second new frontier for how we manage, which will challenge the global system, is digital, cyber, that whole set of issues, where we have no international framework for managing that new part of the economy.
So this all sounds very cheerful. Let me focus on just a few issues that in about 10 minutes we'll go to the floor and you can all ask your brilliant questions. But probably not all of you can, but some of you can. So think about them. Let me focus on one very immediate issue. So I'd like to do the structure and sort of start thinking about international relations and international order, and then have a little bit on domestic responses, focusing a bit on the West. A subject I wrote about in my column this morning. Yeah. On the international side, let's just focus for a minute on US-China. Okay, so depending on how you measure it, that's about half the world economy, right? And unlike the other really big chunk, they're both within the framework of reasonably coherent and powerful states with powerful apparatuses. And they are pretty clearly moving, at least on the American side, towards a rising level of anxiety bordering on paranoia. I apologize if that's offensive, but not much. So from your point of view, Xinghai, what does China think, what do you think about the way US is now behaving, about whether you can manage it? We've got a pause in the trade dispute at the moment, and where it might end up. Is this a manageable friction from your point of view or not? And if not, what might it mean?
No, I certainly hope it's a manageable challenge to us.
Yes, of course.
You know, as the professor described, somehow many American policy thinkers believe that China somehow is a strategic rival, or you said so, across the board to the United States. I don't know how they reach that conclusion. in order to reach that conclusion, you would have to define China as somehow a dangerous country, a country that's challenging all the interests of the United States. I don't think that's the case. I mean, is China a dangerous country? Right? I think it's not, right? I mean, we are just there to modernize ourselves. I mean, China is determined to modernize. Mm. And as China modernizes, given the size of our country, it will be a great contribution to world economy, to science, technology, and everything. And we can work together to advance the interests of the world, as well as the interests of the United States. I mean, 2 years ago here in Davos, that was when President Trump was just elected, right? He had not taken his oath yet. And I was asked this question by a lot of people, during the campaign. Trump was very much against China. And I predict that, after he became president, US-China relation would be good, because he sincerely, as I believe at that time, he sincerely wanted to create a lot of high-value added jobs in the United States. Well, if he wants to do so, he has to export, right? And where does the U.S. exports go? Which country can take up all these exports? It's China. So the road to create higher value-added jobs in the United States passes through Beijing. That's what I predicted. Now, that certainly hasn't happened yet, right? But I think the basic economics is still there, right? I mean, as long as Mr. Trump wanted to create high-value added jobs, a lot of them in the United States, U.S.-China trade relation has to become good. And just for myself, I'm confident that this 90-day negotiation will turn out to be mutually beneficial, will be concluded quite well. Now, of course, there are other issues: technology, security. But we can work out. We can work out. We can discuss. I'm not sure we can work out, but we can discuss. There's one more thing that I want to add before I finish. And the reason a lot of Americans sort of view China as a strategic rival, other than economic reasons, there's another reason. They think that China somehow is a very different country because they have a very different political system, right? And I think there's a danger of viewing a country, right, by how it organizes its domestic politics. We are talking about a new order. A lot of people advocate, somehow the new order should be drawn along the lines of domestic politics. And you only include, the countries with the same kind of domestic political system as the US has. I think this is very dangerous thinking. It's not going to work, because the world is a lot more complicated, right? If you draw lines along domestic political system, the new order will never include Russia, will never include China. And soon it will not be able to include India. Because the Indian democracy will turn out to be very different from the Western democracy going forward as India grows. So we have to think about that. I mean, that the new order we are thinking should be based on the external behavior of a country rather than the internal behavior or how the country runs itself. And the Chinese system has its own feature, right? And I would exhort you, Martin, and the professor to study that system more. You may find out actually the system works in a slightly different way, but it achieves the same results as the Western democracy try to achieve. So for just to give you one example, a lot of people think that somehow, our president, makes all the decisions in China, right? He's sort of at the top, and he does not have to consult with other people. That's not true. That's not true. If he does so, he would have made tremendous mistakes, many, many mistakes. And the fact that China has not made a lot of major mistakes over the last 40 years tells you something about how efficient and how good the system is. There is a lot of internal what we call consultation and consultative democracy that's going on. It's just you don't see it, and many people don't even bother to study it. And perhaps you can learn something from that as well, as I urge you to wage your own domestic political reform.
Okay,
I'll stop here.
Okay.
I've said a lot.
Adam, that raises a whole host of interesting questions. This way of thinking, with which I have some sympathy, is that the real problem we have, or specifically the US has, is it's nothing to do with Chinese intentions, as it were. That's the sort of it's just China's capacity. So one of my favorite statistics is, this is broadly right, if China has the GDP per head of Portugal, its economy is as big as Europe and the US together. And that terrifies the wits out of people, and there's nothing they can do about that. And the second thing is, which Xinghai got, is essentially what we would consider a very 19th century, Palmerston would agree completely with what you just said. We don't care about your system as long as our interests are respected. But that's not the way, whatever you think about how the post-1945 world worked, there was the view of a missionary power internally.
Yeah, they were blocked.
So is the problem globally, as it were, our side? We cannot live with China because of its existence, not because of anything it is or does.
I think the problem for us in coming to terms with China is to come to terms with its existence, not as a subordinate or irrelevant part of the world system, but as an absolutely massive and independent and self-determined entity. This isn't Japan because it's not part of our security umbrella. It's not West Germany because it's not part of our security. It's not the EU even because it's autonomous and it's massive. And I think that is the fundamental problem. And if we shift the terrain to thinking about an even more depressing problem, which is climate change, then the imperative for cooperation with such a capable actor in the STEM field with such enormous governmental capacities seems to me even more compelling. And what I'd like to take up is, just very briefly, is your point about India, which I think is extremely telling. And it seems to me that the populism discussion in the West is shamefully neglecting the seriousness of political developments in India. Because what we see there also, and it highlights by contrast the history of China that I was just touching on in tiny little sketch, is that India did not go through the fires of a modernizing communist dictatorship. It had the much softer form of Nehruvian socialism and then cast that off in the 90s and the 2000s, and the space in Indian politics, which that created, has been occupied by a party, the BJP, whose commitments to our Western norms is vestigial at best. No doubt the forms of Indian democracy are spectacularly dramatic. It's an extraordinary political system in its capacity to even just hold elections. But the output that we have seen from that system, and we're likely to see over the next coming months, is alarming in its potential. And if we take, as it were, the commitment to scientific rationalism and modernization as the thing, in a sense, the stuff with which we could fill an international order that would not be the heavyweight necessarily of human rights, democracy, and so on, if that is the kind of negotiated order that we need, then China, in many ways, is a far more obvious partner than India threatens to become. The game is still to be played in India, of course. It is a democracy. Elections can be won and lost. But nevertheless, you only have to talk to Indians of Muslim extraction right now to realize just how dangerous things can appear there.
I just was in India last week, and I met both the Prime Minister and the former Prime Minister, so I feel quite, and I spent a lot of time working on it. So I find what you say very interesting, and I'm now going to put it to one side. Minouche. I was particularly interested in this last word before we go to questions. There's so many questions here, and they're so profound. I knew this session wouldn't begin to be enough. We should have the day for it, because it's clearly the most important question by far this whole few days has to talk about. Any response you have to constructing an order among great powers with fundamentally different value systems? So how do we both have rivalry and cooperation, which we obviously need, and secondly, can the West fix itself, or have we basically destroyed the political underpinnings of a stable participation in the world order, which is what I'm increasingly worried about.
Yeah. I mean, I think...
Simple questions.
Very simple question. I think we cannot put ourselves in a position where we say, China's rise can't be accommodated. I just think that is a ridiculous setting up the world for inevitable conflict. I sat in my days at the IMF and the World Bank, I had like probably hundreds of hours of meetings in which we debated the ridiculous question of should China be given a greater voice in the shareholding of the Bretton Woods institutions, which is, the obvious answer is yes. And watched how the West, particularly, frankly, Europe,
of course,
the US,
of course,
refused to accommodate that. To be fair, China was incredibly patient and sat through these hundreds and hundreds of meetings where their shareholding in the organizations that manage the world economy was only ever so grudgingly and ever so slowly increased. And that's just not acceptable. On the flip side, I think the view that China is a developing country and should be given considerable concessions in its abidance by international intellectual property rules, trade rules, etc., I think is also not becoming very credible. And I think China will have to make concessions on that. And that ultimately is also in China's interest, because it too is becoming a producer of intellectual property and needs to protect it. So I think there's a deal to be done. But I also agree with you, Martin, that that deal is only sustainable if the West deals with its own domestic economic and political failures. Because until that's done, China as a boogeyman continues to be a politically useful tool for demagogues and populists in the West.
And you would have to agree that right at the moment, it doesn't look as though we're doing a great job.
I would agree with that.
Okay. Questions? Please make them just one-sentence questions if possible. I'll take 3 at a time. I normally do that. And if you're addressed to a particular person, that helps, please. If you stood up, then the mic can get to you, Glenn. If you want to, you can say who you are.
Glenn Hutchins. Martin, well done. Two quick questions. One is, I'm curious how you would see the role of markets in price discovery and liquidity provision, which you describe as short-term capital flows that have no use. I wonder how you would think about that. And second, I'm curious how you regard, Xinghai, the well-documented efforts by the PLA to accumulate huge amounts of intellectual property from American companies, as well as the creation of a massive database of healthcare and financial information on Americans as part of its sanguine role in the New World Order.
Sorry,
Excellent.
the question on
Why don't you think that capital markets, global capital markets, play an invaluable role in price discovery and liquidity provision? The answer to that will be very brief. So we've got 2 great questions. Further questions, please. Could stand up and say who you are.
Brian Schmidt, Australian National University. Xinghai, I guess one of the things we've heard here is the need for China to open up its economy.
Yes.
And I guess I'm curious about what you think can occur and how fast it can happen.
Okay. A third question? Gentleman over there. Yes, please.
Okay. Caller additional from Sahara Group. Listening to messages like this go a long way in putting more puzzle in the presence of somebody that is from Africa. Africa today, 41% of Africa has electricity access. Invariably, 59% are still in the dark. We're speaking to New World Order. America is building a wall. The wall America wants to build, $5.2 billion, will provide no less than 50,000 megawatts of electricity. We're far behind. We're still battling with crawling from the second industrial revolution to the third. And the world is already talking about the fourth. Robotics, employment, which is what Africa needs. How do we connect these dots?
Okay, very good question. So we've got 3 areas. There are 2 questions addressed to you, Xinghai, particularly. one on China's well-known intellectual property theft, organized by the PLA. I think that was more or less, but perhaps I got that wrong. And then a slightly softer question about the commitment to opening up the economy.
Yeah. Well, let me start with this softer question. China is sincere in opening up its economy, and I can, point to you a few things that we've already done. So yesterday, for example, the head of UBS was with me in the same panel, and he pointed out that his bank was given majority control in a JV just in November last year. And then in 2 years' time, by 2021, China has already declared, by 2021, all the foreign banks will be able to own 100% of any operations in China. So this is, the plan is being implemented very smoothly. And then, we also opened up the petrochemical sector last year. BASF, ExxonMobil, both were given a license to operate 100% on petrochemical plants in China. So we are determined to open up because it's good for China. China needs a lot more efficient producers of goods and services from all around the world in the Chinese economy. That will help China. And that will also make the growth of China a huge opportunity for all the world, for all the companies around the world. So on that, no doubt, and you just watch out. More will come. And this afternoon, Vice President Wang, in his speech, I'm sure he will mention that as well. I want to just address a little bit that what you just raised, whether China can be accommodated or not as it grows. I think it's not that difficult to accommodate China, right? Because if you look at history, whenever China was very secure and strong, we felt content, right? We were not aggressive, right, when we were strong. We built a wall around ourselves to prevent our people from going out and prevent other people from coming in. So we are a self-contented, self-confident country, and it's easy to deal with such a country. And as I said, we subscribe to the liberal order. It's good, and China would contribute to that. So that's it. And on cybersecurity, it is a difficult question. It's out of my expertise, certainly. What makes cyber so difficult is that it seems to be it's a zero-sum game, unlike trade. Trade is always a positive-sum game, so we can always reach an agreement. But cyber is difficult. So I wish that there could be a serious global discussion about cyber. How do we manage cybersecurity? To arrive at an order which all the different countries can prosper. Because cyber is so important to every country. I don't have any question answer to your question. I just think that we need a lot more discussion on that. And China is willing to participate.
But you do recognize that for Western business, particularly, the issue of the protection of their intellectual property against Chinese attack is unquestionably very close, and I talk to a lot of them, to number one.
IPR is slightly different, right? Slightly different from cyber.
Yeah, but I think that's where what Glenn was getting at.
Of course, China is becoming an IPR producer. People talk about Huawei a lot, right? I was talking to some of the senior executives of Huawei a few months ago. The IPR protection inside China was not good. So Huawei felt compelled to locate some of their R&D centers in India for IPR protection reasons. Isn't that ridiculous, right? So China needs to do a lot in improving our IPR protection, and I fully agree with you.
Okay. There are people on your side. Whether they matter is a very interesting question. Minouche, I'd like you to deal with why you're so against free capital markets. And two, I think you are probably the right person, but Xinghai might want to add something, because I think it's an important question. we still have, the world still has big development challenges. Africa is very important for everybody. It's where most of the population growth in the world is going to happen. China and the West and the global institutions are all heavily involved. One has the sense that there's a sort of quite dangerous competition between them, and something of a mess emerging as a result. This could be, in principle, an important area where China, the West, and the global institutions cooperate effectively. It doesn't seem really to be happening.
Yeah.
What's your perspective on those two questions?
Yeah. So on the short-term capital flows, I mean, I think the economic evidence is pretty clear that from the recipient's perspective, the best capital flows are foreign direct investment, followed by equity investments, followed by portfolio flows. And the longer term the flows, the better it is for the recipient. And the shorter term flows don't give any huge significant economic benefit. And so from my perspective, the economic benefits are not worth the financial stability risks. And I think putting a little bit of grit in the system, if you're a capital importer, to make those flows stick a bit longer is worth it, because the financial stability risks are not worth it. On Africa, in some ways, Africa has become the new place for competition between China and the West, and I don't think that competition has proved to be particularly healthy or beneficial to Africa. I think the population issues are huge. Africa has about 1 billion people now. It'll have 2 billion in about a decade. It'll have about 4 billion in about 20, 30 years. And that will have huge consequences for the world. And I think there's some huge demographic challenges that, that demographic transition could be faster in Africa if there was more domestic leadership on that agenda. And the biggest worry is where the jobs will come from, particularly given that the path of manufacturing exports, which Asia followed, is not clearly going to be there for African job creation, as you mentioned, because of AI and robotics. And the consequence of the current competition for Africa has resulted in a renewed debt crisis in Africa. Many countries have borrowed heavily from China and from the markets. And I think this is potentially an area where it is in everyone's interest to work a little bit more collaboratively and to not have it be a space for great power competition, because I think it's in everyone's interest that Africa's demographic and economic transformation is successful.
It also points to the extraordinary default of Europe, because in the Sino-American rivalry, there is, as it were, a strategic imbroglio in East Asia, Taiwan, South Korea. America's emplacement in Asia in the course of the Cold War creates an antagonism because of the forward deployment of American military assets. Europe just doesn't appear to have a dog in that fight. And that, on the other hand, Africa is Europe's, really clearly ought to be on Europe's agenda, not because of some imagined imperial role, but simply, apart from anything else, driven by the issue of migration. Because Europe has demonstrated its complete incapacity to deal with flows which are tiny by comparison with what we should reasonably expect going forward. And there is no doubt at all that the fault line in here is not just religion, it's race. And Europe has huge amounts of work to do internally in digesting this. This is, I think, Europe's counterpart to the China problem for America. I think there's a real issue as to whether we can cope. And it ought, obviously, to be an agenda in which Europe is a much more constructive actor. Europe ought to be a source of investment for Africa on an epic, historically unprecedented scale. And that's really where you feel, I think, the missing piece of Europe in this entire equation.
I know that when Germany was, I think, chairing the G20,
Yep.
it asked my friend Paul Collier, who's sort of probably the continent's leading expert on Africa economics, to do. And he did, I think, some very, very interesting work, and then it completely disappeared, which is, I think, very significant. But basically, I think they're in denial about what this means. I can take maybe one or two further questions, if anybody. Yeah, no? One quick. Well, we're going. What's the time? We've got till 45. Yeah, I'll be finished at 45. One question. Grim. Could you stand up? Oh, sure.
It's coming.
A very short question, very
Okay.
sharp.
Well, if China and India have a GDP per cap equal to Europe and America, we're going to be looking at a bar like the one on the left
Yes.
with a bid for the United States.
Yes.
How does the world work in a world like that?
Adam.
I mean, this goes back to our original conversation. Is there any historic precedent for the situation we're in? The answer to your point there is the historic precedent will be, the beginning of our modern era, the current era, in other words, the year of the birth of Christ. So we do not have we do not have any experience of that. And I thought Larry Summers' op-ed in the FT a couple of weeks back, where he posed this question explicitly. Could America adjust to a world in which its GDP was half that of the major power, and your world is even more radical? Is there an American politician who could even openly countenance that scenario, which is just simply a reality coming our way? And the answer was evidently no. Under current circumstances, the space for that conversation is not there. But that is the reality that we face. And from any justice point of view, from the point of view of the mobilization of human capital, which is, after all, the ultimate resource, we should applaud it. What could conceivably be the problem with the two great population giants with deep ancient cultures achieving material standards of living at least comparable to those of the West? If that turns out to be a problem, there's something deeply screwed up about the world. Of course, the environmental envelope is the problem, and so around that we need urgently to make deals, and the question really needs to be in the next generation, how do we cut those deals? But that is the ultimate challenge, I think, for any kind of Western conception of politics, which is, adheres to the notions of equality, one citizen, one vote. That would be a kind of one citizen, one vote scenario in economic terms. Everyone would have the same GDP throw weight. And that is a world we've never lived in or even contemplated living in.
I'm going to bring it to a close. I think this has been, to me, really fascinating to raise so many issues. In this very last section is to sort of raise the biggest. The fundamental point is that the developed countries with around 12% of the world's population and the United States with about 4% cannot possibly expect on any plausible assumptions that their historic position will survive. And what's happening is completely natural. Yeah. And indeed, it's a success in the sense that the ideas they developed about how to run a modern economy over the last few centuries, people around the world have concluded those weren't bad ideas, and we would like to do that. And what's more, we can. So that's the first and crucial, really big point. And the second conclusion for that is, therefore, this isn't a battle for power within the West. It's a fundamental shift in the world system. The third point, of course, is, as you know, the world of the year one was the great civilizations at that time were remarkably isolated. They knew very little about one another, although the Romans did know and very much treasured the fact that the Chinese made silk, for which they paid unimaginable sums of money, leading to stupendous gold and silver drains. But that's a topic we will leave for the moment. But the basic point is they were completely separate, and now we're all on top of one another. The conclusion from this, and then we have fourth major point, the whole global environment, as you discussed, which is going to be stressed massively by what we're trying to do. And as I constantly point out, we are going to fail to deal with that. Climate challenge, and we're going to leave a very huge problem. And then the fifth, it seems to me, final conclusion is, for a whole host of reasons, the West can't cope with this. And it starts by the fact, I think, that the West is not prepared to be honest with itself and with its own citizens about the nature of the changes that are inevitably going to happen, and that somehow we're going to make the West great again. And by which we mean somehow or other, surely that's what really the Orbans, Salvinis, Le Pens, and Trumps have in common. We can go back the way it was, and all these people will go away. And that is a very, very severe delusion. And the very final conclusion, I think, is we do have, and I've been writing a lot about, we have to work out a way in which we have there are clear points of rivalry and competition between our countries and China. That's going to be inevitable. But fundamentally, we have to cooperate, and certainly with a rising India as well, because there's simply no bloody alternative. Unfortunately, except insane ones. And I always conclude those sorts of remarks by pointing out we have a stupendous historical record of choosing the insane alternatives. So I think this is, to me, sorry?
I'm just translating.
They're choosing the insane alternatives.
I don't know what insane, you can translate it. So that, I think, is where we are. And I think this has been a wonderful discussion, sharpening these challenges for us and offering the only way that you can imagine forward. Thank you very much to the panel.